By the way, before I begin, I'd just like to let you all know that I'm pretty informal about these things, as are many of us around here. So if you just want to get up and get some coffee anytime you want, I won't be disturbed. Be my guest. Cookies are up there too. So please don't hesitate to do that. And as it turns out, I was reminded just now, roughly 30 seconds ago, that the potato is 80% water. And we're going to begin our discussion about Brookline annexation tonight by talking a bit about water. And that, of course, is a water molecule. All living things on Earth that we know of find water to be essential to their existence. And we know that water is ubiquitous on Earth. Much of the planet is water. Much of our bodies are water. And it ultimately comes from the stars, like all the elements that make up our bodies in most of the world that we see around us. It's present in many parts of the universe. In fact, there are vast clouds of water vapor many billions of light years away that consist of trillions and trillions and trillions times the water we have here on Earth. So there's a lot of water around, as a matter of fact. And we historians love water, not just because it keeps us alive, like so many of you, but also because water is a connection to the past. Every time you drink a bit of water, of course, you're imbibing millions of molecules that were once coursing by the civilizations of the Amazon, the Indus, the Nile, the Mississippi, and the Seine. So it's a connection to the past, and it helps to explain a lot about Boston. And our talk today is about Boston, Brookline, and ultimately, as we'll see, water. So the history of growth in Boston. Now that we familiarized ourselves with the water molecule, let's go to Boston. The history of growth in Boston is heavily wrapped up in water. Boston exists in the first place, as many of you know, because Reverend William Blackston happened to be setting up his little hermitage on this, the old Shaman Peninsula, when John Winthrop and the Puritans happened to arrive in nearby Charlestown. And Blackston made the mistake of telling Winthrop that the water was very good on the Shaman Peninsula. There were a couple of very nice and clear springs there. So to escape the bad Charlestown water, the Puritans went over to Boston, and Blackston certainly regretted doing that because he shortly found out what those Puritans were like and eventually left within 6 years to go live in Rhode Island. Nobody in their right mind, as the Shaman Peninsula originally existed, would be happy about living there. It was a windswept peninsula. There wasn't a whole lot of trees. The native inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay didn't spend much time there usually because it just wasn't a very good place for a settlement. But Winthrop and the Puritans rather liked it. And as we know, they stayed there for nearly 200 years until 1804, when we see the first example when Boston decided to annex another part of the surrounding area. The first major annexation, 1804, was engineered by a guy named William Tudor, often known as Billy Tudor, who, as a young man, at a time when the British Army was being besieged in Boston by Washington's army, happened to be acting as the very first Judge Advocate General in American history. He was Washington's lawyer with the Revolutionary Army. And because he was a young man, he was thinking about marriage, and there was a particular woman that he was very much in love with, and her name was Delia Jarvis. The problem with Delia Jarvis, however, was she was a Tory, and she was living with her family in East Boston, then called Noddle's Island, separated from Billy Tudor and the Revolutionary Army by the inconvenient water of Boston Harbor. And Billy Tudor really wanted to go see Delia Jarvis, despite her Tory sympathies, and he knew that if he took a boat across to see her, the British fleet may well seize him. So what he decided to do, according to the story, was swim back and forth to Noddle's Island, thus entitling him to be known as, at least in my background, although I don't think anybody else calls him this, as the American Leander. Remember the old myth of hero and Leander swimming the Hellespont? And that's what Billy Tudor did to be with his lady love. She spurned his advances for the longest time, but she finally decided to marry him. And in 1804, we find Delia and Billy happily ensconced in their lovely home in Lynn, but they would spend some of the time here on their other property in what they used to call Dorchester Neck. This is Nook Hill on Dorchester Neck. And Billy Tudor figured, even though that was a part of Dorchester, he figured if that was joined to Boston and linked to the rest of the Shaman Peninsula by a nice convenient bridge, then Billy Tudor's and Delia Tudor's land would skyrocket in value and they'd live happily ever after. But they would still need to get it annexed by Boston. And so they put together a syndicate. They got Harrison Gray Otis to join up with them. And Harrison Gray Otis was so intent upon engineering all this that he bribed the town meeting of Dorchester a very substantial sum of money to try to get them to give up Dorchester Neck so that it could join Boston. It didn't work. The town meeting stood firm, but Harrison Gray Otis knew his way around the Massachusetts legislature. And in 1804, Dorchester Neck became part of Boston, first major land annexation in Boston history. I'm sorry to say that Billy and Delia did not get rich on this, at least not as rich as they hoped to be. But the nice thing about it was they did build a bridge right about from there to there. And if you were on that bridge, what you had before you was the best view of Boston in existence, so lovely that young couples used to go back and forth on the bridge just to gaze upon the sight and hold each other's hands. And that's why they called the Bridge of Sighs, the old bridge from Dorchester Neck to Boston Neck. What is that now, this neighborhood here? Anybody?
What?
That's South Boston. That's modern South Boston. This is how Broadway goes like that now. Well, we're back to water. The bridge was across water, of course, the inconvenient water of South Bay if you wanted to make some money in Dorchester Neck. And water, like everything else, has a chemical composition. We just saw that in the original slide. And like those vast clouds of water vapor many billions of light years away, water in the universe would be here regardless of us. Water doesn't need us, we need it. And if we were to disappear, water would go on doing what water does. But human beings, of course, have a lot to do with water. And what we do is we give things in the world meanings based upon how important we think they are, based upon how we use them. Water is like everything else. We give water meaning. Water has many meanings in human culture. And in the 19th century, especially the middle of the 19th century, water had come to have a particular meaning to many people in the United States. Water meant progress, a certain understanding, at least, of human progress. Traditional rural communities, like Brookline had been for most of its past, and here's a view of what Boston looked like from Brookline earlier in the 19th century. Traditional rural communities had to make do, of course, with drawing their household water from various pumps close by the property or on the property. Backyard wells was how you get your water from farm to farm, rural dwelling to rural dwelling. But the mark of a truly modern, progressive place was not the backyard pump. It was getting your water through a central water supply from a lake or a reservoir, perhaps many miles away from where the town happened to be, drawn to the town, drawn to every home and hydrant by a progressive modern system of pipes and aqueducts. And Boston had such a modern system in the middle of the 19th century, and that modern system was based a long way away out in Middlesex County. That is the source of Boston's water. Anybody know what that is? That's right, that's Lake Cochituate. And in 1848, for the first time, Lake Cochituate water arrived to great celebration on Boston Common. 14 miles via aqueduct and eventually piping from Natick all the way into Boston. And that water supply was thought to be pretty good. It was thought to be pretty substantial for 300,000 people in the city of Boston. So the idea by the late 19th century was, if you wanted to be part of this modern water system, if you wanted that water without having to do much of anything to get your own water from your own sources, the thing to do was join Boston. To join Boston and any of the surrounding communities not too far away from the traditional town was to get that water, a modern, clean, dependable system of water. Now, ironically perhaps, the town through which Lake Cochituate water passed in order to get to Boston was, of course, the town of Brookline. And Brookline did not partake of that water. There was a holding reservoir for that water that is only steps away from where we are now on the other side of Route 9. But Brookline did not partake of it. That was Boston water and meant for Bostonians. So here in Brookline, the Aspinwalls and the Fishers and the Lowells and the Lees, as well as the occasional Joneses and Emersons and Fays, depended upon their own wells and springs as they had for many, many years before that. And that was fine as long as Brookline looked like the slide I showed you just before this one. But by the end of the Civil War, and right after that, Brookline was beginning to look a bit more like that. That's Brookline Village in the latter part of the 19th century. So as Brookline grew, and as the town eventually got to be the size of about 6,500 to 7,000 people by the beginning of the 1870s, the thought began to be difficult to ignore. Brookline needed a central water supply like many other towns had, and especially like Boston had. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the idea that all of Brookline looked like that in 1870. Nothing could be further from the truth. It just depended upon where you were. Much of it still looked rural in the 1870s. And if you were to stand at Starbucks, for example, right over here, close to Washington Square, you would swear you were in the country. Beacon Street was still a dirt passageway, of course. It was only 50 feet wide. And if you were to stand on Corey Hill with its lovely view of Boston, looking a bit to the north into the east, you would see Harvard Street, what they used to call the road to the college, going towards the Charles River, still lined with a number of farms, as it had been for many, many years. But there were 6,500 people in Brookline, substantially more than there had been 20 or 25 years before, a lot more than there had been, for example, in 1836, when the town meeting first provided that if you allowed your cows to stray on public roads, you could actually be fined, perhaps. It's a long way away from that, and many of the people living in Brookline were not the old traditional families that had been there for, in some cases, well over 100 years. Those families were still there, but a growing number of families were not farmers. They were professionals, or at least led by professionals, who rose early in the morning every day to make their way down to the Boston and Albany railroad tracks in Brookline Village to catch the train into Boston, where they had their workplace. And as the town grew, and as especially the Beacon Street corridor looked like a very promising avenue of development in the future, everybody understood that a lot of the development would be on smaller plots, and those plots needed water if they were ever going to be viable. A growing, modernizing town needed a central water supply. And why not take advantage of the one that went right through town already? Boston water from Lake Cochituate. To get access to it, all the water they would need, at least that's the argument, all they had to do was join the embrace of Boston. All they had to do was be annexed by Boston. And why not? Brookline would merely be returning to its parent city, from which it had unfortunately separated back in 1705. Boston was all for it. I'm going to quote from the Boston Globe. "Let us then have the ancient town of Brookline," said the Globe in 1873. "Its magnificent estates and cozy residences are already an appendage of the city, and there is located the splendid reservoir in Brookline of this very city's water supply. Every consideration which went to make the acquisition of West Roxbury desirable unites in recommending that the city be rounded out with the addition of Brookline. After that, Cambridge and other towns could be annexed, according to the Globe, to the gratification and pride of all concerned." Now, the Globe had reason to be confident. Only an old fogey, it would seem, would oppose the annexation of old Brookline to modern, progressive, rising Boston. What was sentiment compared to dollars and cents? After all, as one annexationist put it, that is one supporter of annexation here in Brookline, look at this as a business proposition. It is the height of folly to tax ourselves $650,000 for a new waterworks when we can have it right now from Lake Cochituate just as easily as Bostonians, simply by joining the metropolis to the east. And the example of Charlestown was before every eye at just the same time in 1873. Now, Charlestown was older than Boston. And by the 1870s, 28,000 people crowded its narrow streets. The place was nearly surrounded by water. Our theme. 5 bridges connected most Charlestonians to the outside world. 5 bridges. And by 1873, every single one of those bridges needed major repairs. Joining Boston would allow Charlestonians to spread those repairs throughout 300,000 taxpayers in Boston, instead of shouldering the expense themselves. In plain English, one Charlestonian supporter of annexation said, with refreshing honesty, "If we can make Boston pay a large share of our tax bills, we shall be happy." Few residents of Charlestown...
Nothing has changed.
There you go. That's right. Few residents of Charlestown had a lineage that went back to the 18th century, much less the 17th century. a lot of them were attracted to the argument that only the odd old fogey would want to hang on to the independent city government of Charlestown. And what I want to do now is read a quote I rather like from a Charlestonian named E.W. Keyes, who was arguing for annexation. And Keyes was referring to people who wanted to hang on for old time's sake to their traditional independent Charlestown. He said, and you'll see what he's referring to in a minute, I sometimes think, he said, it'd be a lot better to pitch all those people together and make a monument of them on Breed's Hill instead of going to the expense of carting all that granite from Quincy. Call a rose by any other name, he said, it'll smell as sweet. So will Charlestown sound as sweet when we call it Boston. Now, the fact that Charlestown would lose its old independent city government didn't matter to Keyes and many others in Charlestown. Many of them knew, and many of them complained about the fact that a lot of North Enders who worked at the Navy Yard in Charlestown would freely vote in Charlestown city elections at the behest of Democratic ward bosses, even though they didn't live in Charlestown. And why be proud of that kind of thing? Join Boston, and at least we're going to be part of a modern progressive whole, and we'll get those bridges paid for, as well as a new fire station, if all goes well. Now, as far as the argument that nature determined that Charlestown would be separate from Boston after all this water between the two, several annexationists pointed out, rather sensibly I think, that separation by water didn't seem to be very bad for Paris, didn't seem to be bad for London. Why should we be complaining about it? All of which raises a puzzle. West Roxbury decided to join Boston in 1873 in order to get access to that Lake Cochituate water. And Charlestown also saw this as a practical matter of dollars and cents. Join Boston, we get those bridges repaired and kept up as they should be. All submitted to annexation, along with Brighton, same year, by lopsided votes in 1873. Why didn't the same thing happen in Brookline? Why didn't most residents of Brookline see this the way Charlestonians saw it? That is, a mere business proposition. Well, in March of 1873, as annexation was very much in the air, that is, the issue was very much in the air, you might be forgiven for thinking that Brookline would go the way that West Roxbury, Brighton, and Charlestown were going that same year. Because the great issue in March of 1873, before the Brookline town meeting, was, of course, the pressing issue, what to do about water. Where will our water supply come from? And that issue was a stalking horse, as we might say, for annexation. Because if you answered that question, we should get the water from Lake Cochituate, that was as good as saying you're in favor of annexation. But those who opposed annexation, those who wanted Brookline to remain Brookline, had another solution to the great water problem, and that is to pump the water from the area around the Charles River. Back then, the northern border of Brookline, unlike today, extended all the way to the Charles River. So if Brookline wanted to, by special act of legislature, they had the privilege of pumping water from the Charles River. And presumably, if you would support that, if you would support appropriating money to create waterworks close to the Charles River to supply Brookline water for the foreseeable future, that meant you wanted Brookline to remain independent. But if you supported that Charles River idea, despite the idea of paying $650,000 to create those waterworks, presumably that meant that the Boston idea held no appeal for you. So that's why the water issue was really a stalking horse for what would come later, the great annexation debate of the fall. Now, the emotions prodded by the annexation controversy easily spilled over into this great water dispute at the Brookline town meeting in March. People were very excited about this because they knew what it meant. Lake Cochituate water in the future, we join Boston. We go to the Charles, we stay Brookline. And because of the emotions raised by annexation, that water meeting, according to the Brookline Chronicle, was the most raucous in recent years. So the commission representatives got up there, and they said the whole thing's going to cost $650,000. Proponents of annexation, those who wanted to join Boston, answered at the meeting that that's nonsense. Everybody knows, they said, that no matter how much you estimate that this is going to cost $650,000, once you start digging, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be way more expensive than that. And they were saying that back in 1873. And others who opposed the Charles River idea pointed out the rather disturbing fact that if you're going to get Charles River water for Brookline, you're going to get that water after it has passed through 14 communities who were releasing their sewage into the Charles River. Some of which, that is some of that sewage, anybody could smell if they were to walk along the Charles River, especially in summer. And although some who opposed annexation in one of that Charles River water said it's not really the river that smells, it's just the mud of the Charles River flats that smell because it's out there in the summer heat baking for a while. It's not really the river. One proponent of annexation said, as if any good, honest mud ever smelled like the Charles River flats. Clearly, this is a sewage problem. And you can even see that sewage now and then if you looked in the right place, especially in the summer months when the river was at a certain level. So the Brookline Chronicle, in reporting on this debate, was very careful about outlining what both sides were saying, because this was important. This is how you know what Brookline thought about annexation. How do they feel about the water? So after a big debate, opponents of the Charles River scheme, that is those who probably might want to join Boston, won by a mere 70 votes. So it didn't look good for Brookline as an independent town if all you believed was that the water issue was a stalking horse for annexation. A great roar of approval went up from the annexationists, at which point William Aspinwall, who was a major opponent of annexation, stood up and tried to get things delayed by a procedural motion, hoping perhaps to delay what he now very much feared was sentiment in favor of annexation. And as Aspinwall stood up and tried to delay things, an annexationist named Bishop stood up and mocked Aspinwall, mocked his emotions, mocked his regret. And this is what Bishop said at the town meeting. He compared Aspinwall to Othello after Othello found out that Desdemona apparently was flirting with Cassio. Farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content, farewell the plumed troops in the big wars, mocking Aspinwall. To which Aspinwall's friends shouted to Bishop, get out, pull him out, get out. To which Bishop retorted, go on, I like hisses. They come from adders and curs and snakes, and barking dogs never bite. We know the victory we have won. That is a victory for annexation. We know the victory we have won, and we have done it well. If this is not the case, then we had better set up a lunatic asylum and hire that gentleman, Aspinwall, as our teacher. So it's an exciting meeting, one of the most exciting meetings in modern memory. And the Massachusetts Senate took this as very good evidence that Brookline probably did favor annexation. Yet Aspinwall and his supporters were probably right in objecting that the vote should not necessarily have been read that way. Many who voted against Charles River water probably voted against it because they were worried about the effluvia flowing down from Waltham in Watertown. And in fact, one reason Aspinwall and his allies would soon save Brookline, that is independent Brookline, was they saw hope in that town meeting. The very storminess, the very emotions of that town meeting seemed to have inspired them with hope. A new tactic to try to save independent Brookline. For when the anti-annexationists decided to go to make their case to the people of the town, in preparation for the October town meeting where the question would be decided. They decided to found their own newspaper, significantly established on July 4th, 1873. And a chief argument they would make was that to join Boston, to become part of a great city, would be to give up their cherished town meeting form of government and become simply another ward of Boston. The water argument was practical, it made good sense, it was good business. And it had won the day in West Roxbury. But perhaps Brookline might survive by summoning the shades of the New England past. To make the case to the rest of the town, the anti-annexationists, led by William Aspinwall and Alfred Chandler, decided not just to defend their notion of Charles River water, but to put things on a loftier plane. They would talk about the democratic glories of the New England town meeting, which of course would be lost forever if Brookline were to be simply Ward 19 of Boston. And no one did that better than Alfred Chandler, who I think, and some of the Brookliners here may be able to confirm this, lived not too far away from here, Alfred Chandler. And this is what he said in the Brookline Independent, the brand new newspaper. Those who read our history and study well its philosophy cannot fail to remark the beneficial influence which the New England town government has had upon the whole nation. These little republics, he said, are the admiration of intelligent Europeans and should be the pride and glory of every true Yankee heart. Long may they stand. The very contentiousness of the water meeting proved that the day had not passed when people could exchange their views vociferously yet freely in the confines of a town meeting. How else were Americans trained in free government? It's the town meeting, the true democracy of the town meeting. And here's my favorite part. Nowhere else in the world, he said, can the moving forces of political life in their naked simplicity be seen as in the town meeting of a New England town. And here's why. One thing I like to tell my students about when the time comes, and it does come around every 3 or 4 years or so, is the story of Alexis St. Martin. Now, Alexis St. Martin was a frontiersman in the state of Michigan who met with an unfortunate accident that consisted of a bullet hole in his side. And it did not heal properly, so there was a big hole in his side. Not too good for Alexis St. Martin, but very good for medical science, because there was a doctor up there on the frontier named Beaumont who decided to take this opportunity to look into the stomach of poor Mr. St. Martin, because remember, the hole had never healed. You could actually look into the stomach. And what the doctor would do is take bits of food, connect them to string, and put the food in the stomach, holding onto the string, and watch the gastric juices digest the food. And that's how we learn what gastric juices do, by observing them in St. Martin's stomach. That's Dr. Beaumont. Yeah, Dr. Beaumont would do that. Now, Dr. Beaumont eventually annoyed poor St. Martin, and when St. Martin finally died, he provided in his will that nobody would ever be able to exhume the body to look at his stomach ever again, now that he was dead. But this is why I bring him up, because Chandler, in the Brookline Independent, compared the town meeting to Alexis St. Martin's stomach. Because just like the stomach, you can watch what goes on. It's transparent. A town meeting was like the stomach. A town meeting is such that you can see the whole process work. Nothing is concealed, nothing can be. Now, the anti-annexationists, now gathering their forces, could make pretty extravagant claims. If only the French or the Spanish had had the New England town meeting, they said, they wouldn't have those civil wars or those royalist coups. But the point I want to make now about this shift in rhetoric to talking about the town meeting, not just the water, which Chandler continued to exist, was pure as the driven snow. The importance of this is not to suggest that these were all a bunch of populist, egalitarian Democrats here in Brookline who loved the pure democracy of the town meeting. The reason I bring it up is that by talking about tradition, the Brookline town meeting, the old form of government that had stood the test of time and that had been good enough for their ancestors, they had come up with an argument that could mean several things to all manner of different people. It might mean a source of elitist local control that they couldn't have any more, of course, if they joined Boston. It could mean that, depending on who you were. But it could also mean an allegiance to genuine participatory democracy, depending on who you were. That's why it was so appealing. And against that argument, the annexationists had few substantial points that could really challenge it, at least on that emotional and politically astute level. So in September of 1873, and we can go on from that slide, which you may be getting sick of. Here is a pretty good illustration of what we're talking about here. If you wanted to argue that Brookline does not belong independent, especially after West Roxbury became part of Boston, you could do no better than talk about a slide like this. And the water, of course, was going right through Brookline, so why not simply take advantage of it? And when Chandler and Aspinwall were talking about the town meeting, the thing that modern eyes will probably think immediately of seeing is the Rockwell painting of a democracy, the New England town meeting. And they spoke of the town meeting in glowing terms just like that. So if you wanted to praise the town meeting, what better way to do it but to summon the ghosts of the New England heroic past? but also by bringing up somebody else. Now, you could bring up what was going on in Boston at the time, and the anti-annexationists did just that. Boston had a city government. Boston had long had a city government, and it was Boston, of course, that notoriously permitted out-of-work sailors from all parts of the world to be rounded up by Democratic ward bosses and turned magically into permanent Democratic voters whenever an election came around when their services would be necessary. And it is in Boston, in the election of 1872, notoriously, that 28 voters were listed on the official voting rolls as evidence of as a residents of 55 Merrimack Street, and 34 voters were listed as residents permanently at an address on Stillman Street, both of which were notorious taverns, no bigger than this room, where nobody spent the night, all because that would be very convenient votes when needed. Boston, notoriously, as all readers of the Boston Journal knew, was a place where poll supervisors too often were like this one guy that the paper talked about, who spent the day of a recent election contentedly sipping from a concoction of beer and brandy in a rather large vessel, on the assumption, he said, that this was a surefire preventive for smallpox. And as he was drinking, checking off the names of voters who were never, in fact, physically there. But of course, if you wanted to make the case for a town meeting government against a modern Boston-style city government, the best thing to do was not even to point to Boston. We all know in the 1870s what the best thing to do. New York, that's right, Boss Tweed. That's what city government is, according to the anti-annexationists. The Aspinwalls, whose family went back to the Punch Hole Tavern days, and their close representative in 1873, William Aspinwall, brought up Boss Tweed whenever he could, because unlike St. Martin's stomach, you can't see what Boss Tweed does in a city government. He does things in secret because he knows the people to negotiate with. And here's another Boss Tweed slide. There's Boss Tweed. Jail's not big enough to hold him. So to join Boston would be to risk the corrupting influence of city government and professional politicians, unlike the citizen participants in town meetings that governed Brookline's affairs. Now the town's representative, Brookline's representative in the general court, made this point with the kind of scriptural language that is too often lost, I think, in modern political discourse. Boston, he said, was like this woman. Boston, Benton, that's the representative, said, was like Jezebel, Ahab's wife Jezebel, who longed for the vineyard of Naboth, which was right next door, and so schemed to murder Naboth to give Ahab and Jezebel the property. To which a Boston representative at the general court rose and said, I object to the Ahab business. But you see what the argument is going to be. To lose the town meeting, to join Boston, was to lose the pure democratic glories of the town meeting, and to lose local control, of course, over Brookline's destiny. And depending on who you were, you could think about the democratic part or the local elite part. The town meeting would raise both ideas in your mind. And what a good way to rouse sentiment against annexation. So even though that water vote didn't look good, the independent thought they had a strategy. They're going to keep talking about water, but this is going to be in every issue of the independent. Preserve Brookline, preserve the town meeting, avoid corruption. And to me, the interesting thing is how well this argument for the purity of the town meeting dovetailed with water discussions. Because on the one hand, Brookline could get pure Lake Cochituate water from 14 miles away, but to get that pure water, they would be permanently corrupted by the city of Boston. And there was no going back. Once they're in Boston, that's it. But if they were to dig those wells on the banks of the Charles, maybe that water wouldn't be much good. But they could filtrate it. They could purify it. They could make that water good. That's a problem they can solve. Lake Cochituate, we get purity, but we really get corruption. The Charles River, it might not be so good now, but we'll make it good. And it will always be good. It will be Brookline water. Our large cities, said Alfred Chandler, are encountering the perils of corruption and fraud on a gigantic scale caused by the general instability, or the general inability, he said, of substantial citizens to take a controlling part in the management of public affairs. Let us remain, he said, a delightful suburb, not become a slum of Boston. For, as the orator of the day had said the year before, in dedicating the new Brookline Town Hall on Washington Street, tyranny and oppression always dreaded and hated town meetings. Now that was the kind of argument that could raise powerful emotions, and it did. And the annexationists had nothing so lofty and so appealing to counter it. They could talk, and they did. They could talk about the expense of going all the way to Dedham every time there was court business. But getting to Boston was no picnic either. And everyone knew that the Suffolk County Courthouse was about to fall down anyway. The annexationists could talk about their love of Brookline, which made them want to achieve annexation in order for Brookline to expand as it was meant to do in league with growing Boston. Annexation would spur development, the roads would extend, all would be better. But that only left the annexationists to the charge that the whole idea of annexation was just a land jobbing speculation by a few supporters of annexation who had some property that stood to rise in value if the vote was taken that way, just like Billy Tudor back there on Nook Hill in Dorchester Neck in 1804. And the opponents of annexation had a point here, after all. General Whitney, who was a leading supporter of annexation, did own a good bit of land in North Brookline along the Beacon Street corridor that did stand perhaps to rise in value with annexation. And another leading annexationist, George Griggs, had big parcels around Coolidge Corner, back then little more than a crossroads with a little store on it. So perhaps they would do better with annexation. Perhaps this was a corrupt, selfish argument. And the argument they made about land values going up if annexation went through reminded one Brookliner of the old rhyme, "I'll bury my love in this garden, 'twill make the apples grow." Although for this Brookliner, men like Whitney wanted to bury us in Boston so that their apple trees would grow. Now if you look over here again, we'll leave Jezebel. One argument, of course, that the annexationists made was that a glance at the map will tell you annexation is inevitable anyway. We're bound to join Boston. Why not make it now? That's just the way things are going. That's what General Whitney said. To which George Towle, a relative newcomer to the town, responded with the following question. This inevitability of Brookline joining Boston. Has General Whitney been consulting the Oracle of Delphi? Has General Whitney been hobnobbing with the Roman augurs? And anyway, as many pointed out, death is inevitable too, but you don't want to hasten it along. And the pro-annexationist side could and did raise the argument that if Brookline joined Boston, Brookline would clean up Boston by its healthy and virginal influence almost. Brookline can clean up Boston if it's the 19th Ward. To which Alfred Chandler's friend Thomas Parsons responded, I think rather rationally, by insisting that you're going to talk about us cleaning up Boston? Charity begins at home, he said. Charity begins at home. Let us maintain our own house without worrying about cleaning up Boston, however you may advise that we do it. An argument, by the way, that based upon recent presidential election results could be made in regard to U.S. foreign policy by many Brookliners. It seems to me that's what I thought of when I read what Towle said. And the annexationists often pointed out, and they thought this is one of the better arguments, they often pointed out that Brookline merchants spent their working days in Boston anyway. They're always going down to take the train. They go into town, they work, and they come back into Brookline. They depend on Boston for their livelihood. So why not, in view of the fact that their sphere of operations is Boston anyway, join the city and make it official? To which opponents of annexation in the Brookline Independent responded that for a Brookline merchant, for a Brookline manufacturer, their real sphere of operations is not Boston. That's just where they have their office. Their sphere of operation is the world. The markets in sugar, indigo, wool, throughout the globe. Quote, Boston might sink into the sea or be burnt up, but our merchants and manufacturers will go on. Boston he said. It's just a convenient place for us to keep our guests. Now, what could annexationists say to this? An editorial running in the Independent shortly before the October town meeting that would decide all this. And I think this puts it very well. This is our last appeal to those who would save old Brookline. Her true men, out for her real interests. Few or none are the well-founded arguments in favor of the destruction of this ancient town. But many are those for preserving the ancient institutions handed down to us by our hard-working, patriotic, and God-fearing ancestors. And by September, leading into October, there was good reason now to think that most voters in Brookline probably agreed with Moses Williams, who, at a fervent anti-annexationist meeting before the big town meeting vote, proclaimed that he was a proud graduate of the schools of Brookline and that he had always remembered one thing, and that was to say no when the occasion demanded it. And this was such an occasion. Finally, the great day came. October 7th, 1873. The town meeting would decide Brookline's fate. Join Boston or not. It rained all day. But despite that, the attendance at the town meeting was about 5 times what it normally was. An indication, I think, of the intelligence of the strategy of pitching the anti-annexationist case on something of mass appeal. Preservation of the town meeting, whatever it is, an individual listener might understand by that term. So well over 1,000 people packed the old Brookline Town Hall to hear long speeches on both sides, punctuated by applause and hisses, depending on what somebody was saying. And when the time finally came to vote, the first voter, William Wellman, dropped his slip into the no box, no annexation. And according to the Brookline Independent, his face was beaming with the brightness that only illumines those who know they have done right. And as the voting went on, bulletins were posted outside on the walls of the town hall so that those who couldn't fit in or who were not permitted to vote could keep track of the tallies. And after you did vote, you might go keep track of the tallies that way. It was a time of great excitement. All day as the voting went on, the no votes led throughout. It was never really close. The no votes led throughout. And the last vote, just when the town meeting was about to conclude the voting, was cast by a man who ran as fast as he could down the hall, just off the train from Boston, to cast the last vote against annexation. The final tally was 706 against annexation, 299 for. Such a complete reversal of fortune from what you might have expected from that water meeting back in March that many in the hall could scarcely believe it. Brookline had been saved. And the motto of the Brookline Independent, "Long live Brookline," seemed to have been vindicated. For a full 5 minutes, there was loud, uproarious displays of cheering. Men tossed their hats. They stood up on the chair, cheering themselves hoarse, while sullen partisans of the annexationist cause, like Whitney and Griggs, stood off on the side and watched it like baseball players watching celebrants of the World Series after they had just lost. Now, more efforts would be made to push through annexation in the years ahead, but all failed. Brookline would stay Brookline. And it would get its water eventually. It would get its water taken from about 170 wells driven into the ground close by the Charles River at substantial cost, much as proposed at that March town meeting. But the water did not actually come from the Charles River, as it turned out. The water came from underground streams that went into the river and hence were cleaner than the water otherwise would be. And as I understand it, and some of you probably know more about this than me, the water that they originally got turned out to have a bit of a problem. There were little bits of green stuff in the water that were rather unsightly. And it turned out that that was algae that would get there naturally because the water was collected in a reservoir exposed to the sun for a bit too long. So what they eventually did was they dug underground storage reservoirs, one of them right here on Fisher Hill, so that the sun wouldn't go onto the water, and then it was much better. Now, I think my ultimate argument here is the frequency with which annexationists were driven away and countered by this town meeting argument showed that summoning the ghost of the old Republican town meeting system still resonated with many people in Brookline. Whether you were an old family from the 17th century, maybe even a founding family, or close to that, or one of the new-coming families who came here in the middle or the early 19th century and had a father or a head of the family who worked in Boston, still that argument resonated with you, especially when compared to the tales of corruption that were associated with city governments in Boston, New York, and across the country. And I'd like, because our theme is water, to conclude this way. Alfred Chandler made this point explicitly. Brookline could never really be part of Boston. It didn't work that way. Because what does Brookline have? All around these beautiful drumlin hills, created by water, created by the retreating glaciers of many millennia past. Brookline was a place of byways, meandering streets, and hills, not like the flat back bay that Bostonians were creating in the 1870s. Those back bay streets, those straight avenues that are so modern and so progressive, had no necessary application to Brookline, with its byways, its hills, and its irregularities. It simply could not match up to Boston streets. What about the idea that all this talk about town meetings in byways, in hills, and old Brookline, what about the idea that it's mere sentiment? It's not a business proposition, it's mere sentiment. And this is what George Towes said, Brookliner, about that argument. Sentiment is the impulse which gives beauty and happiness and comfort to life. The brightest joys are not susceptible to arithmetical demonstration. No more are the streets and the roads of Brookline susceptible to right angles in geometrical precision. And the upshot, of course, was that Brookline would stay Brookline, and that would allow Brookline to be in charge of its own affairs. So who should come by the greatest landscaper of all time? Frederick Law Olmsted, who would take advantage of that strange topography to glorify the byways, the streets, the hills of Brookline, not reduce it to a pre-existing Bostonian kind of grid. We should celebrate that generation for that. And since it's the 50th anniversary of Newbury College, why not celebrate Newbury as well? A place that, just like Brookline, insisted on being its own thing, not like anything else. Its own entity with its own characteristics, glories, and advantages. A place that allows me, an early 19th century historian, to talk about Dante if I want, because I like Dante so much, and no other college would do that. Newbury is Newbury, and Brookline is Brookline, and for that, I hope you'll join me. Long live Brookline! Is largely based on a lot of research I've done in the newspapers, the speeches, and what I could find. But mine is not the only one. So if anybody has other comments to make or questions, go ahead. Threats, anything like that? Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering about how independent the Brookline Independent happened to be, whether or not there were any, anyone writing for annexation at that point, or was it exclusively, established and used at that time to put forward arguments against annexation?
It was established solely to fight the annexation despite. It was established in the summer of 1873, not long after the March town meeting. And they would print up the best arguments they could summon against annexation. And they would bring up the pro-annexation side, but they would always give that a paragraph, and then a series of arguments against it, and then something else. So they were very, very much standing for a certain part of the controversy. And after October of 1873, after the town meeting vote, and shortly after that went out of business. Because the big newspaper then was the Brookline Chronicle was there for a while, the Brookline Transcript was there. But the Independent went out of business after 1873. Yes?
Could I ask this question of people who might be here from Brookline, who have lived with other people here from Brookline for a long time? Anybody who's been
A long time?
For,
Since the 1980s.
yeah?
Give us a number.
So do you see, is there something in what Dan said about the spirit and the legacy that you still think holds true in the town meeting, in the spirit and the politics of the town? I was hoping that would get a laugh. Now you have to explain that laugh.
Nothing has changed. Town meeting, the only difference is it's smaller.
It's small.
It's only 300, 250.
Yeah, representative town meeting.
Who actually qualified to vote in the town meeting in 73?
Oh, well, that's a good question. It's all mail, and you had to pay, well, you didn't have to pay. If you paid a poll tax, you could qualify as a voter, and about 500 voters did that. And then the other voters, I think, although some of you may be able to correct me on this, I think as long as you could show otherwise that you were a full-time adult resident of the town, you could
Property
vote.
owners?
Well, there were lessees, though. I mean, there were people who leased, I think, who did vote. The Irish tradesman population, many of them could vote, and I think they leased. But I could be wrong about that.
I think somebody could correct me, but I think the poll tax was if you didn't own property.
Okay, poll tax if you don't own property.
If you did own property, then
That's probably exactly right. Yes, if you did own property, you could vote. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. So there were about 1,200 voters in 1873 who fulfilled those necessary qualifications. There are probably more who just never bothered. But 1,200 were those who were officially on the list. Yes, go ahead.
I also read that the annexation, not annexation, was helped by the fact that Brookline was composed mainly of the very rich that worked in Boston, and then the people who worked for those households who didn't sort of want to fall part of the Boston
Good.
city too.
So that's a very interesting point, and that's the argument made by Professor Carr up at UMass Lowell. He makes that argument. Carr, I think that's his name, right? I think there's something to that, because in the usual town meeting, where maybe 200 to 300 voters would show up, the leading citizens, the traditional elite who really wanted to take a leading role in town affairs, knew there weren't going to be that many voters. So as long as they could depend on tradesmen support, those who depended upon the elite for work and for contracts and things like that, they could constitute what the annexation is called a ring. It's the old guard, it's the Irish laborers, and they get what they want. One depends upon the other. But I think my argument is, although that would hold true for your usual town meeting, if you're going to have a big question that the whole town was involved in, if 1,200 voters are going to show up, you've got to make an argument that goes beyond the ring. You've got to make a more appealing argument to those who might otherwise not go to town meeting and who wouldn't consider themselves in any way beholden to the official upper crust, and wouldn't be part of the Irish working element in what they used to call the marsh. So I think in this particular vote, I don't think it's that ring that a tradesman and elite alliance that explains it. I think it's an argument that could be a lot of different things to a lot of different people, made very well by the anti-annexations. So that would be the position I hold. I could be wrong. That's my argument. Yeah?
you mentioned the marsh,
Yes.
and what's interesting about the marsh is that a group of people, and I'm trying to remember the date, it's a little before this, the marsh was part of Roxbury originally. The border between Brookline and Roxbury was on the west side of High Street, and the group of people in the marsh petitioned, I think, to the state, to have that piece between the Muddy River and High Street annexed to Brookline. And when we first came here in the 70s, I met an older man, my age I suppose, who said he had gone to Roxbury Latin because anybody who lived down on the slope below, in that area that once been part of Roxbury, was allowed to go to Roxbury Latin as if they had been part of Roxbury.
Oh, I see. That is interesting. And I also know that the area, of course, that was touching the Charles River, that used to be part of Brookline, that was surrendered to Boston by a special legislative enactment that the Brookline town meeting agreed to not long after this. I don't know exactly when it was. It's just when they eventually built BU there. So does anybody know when that was? When Brookline lost the Charles River Bank? I'm not sure exactly, but it wasn't long after this.
Another question I had is, how did the reservoir that was serving Boston end up in the middle of Brookline?
Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that it was land that was rather swampy anyway, not much good for building. It was very close to the city, so you needed something close to the city for something that would allow easy transfer to pipes and hydrants. I think that has something to do with it, but you may have.
The answer is essentially the aqueduct, which flowed naturally, like a Roman aqueduct,
Gravity.
by gravity,
Yeah.
downhill 3.5 inches per mile, could have gone to a couple of places. And there was a proposal for Quarry Hill. Boston didn't own anything out here, so it had to be in some other town. And the engineers who did the study eventually decided that that was the best place for it. And so they bought the land and built the reservoir.
And now, of course, it's one of the nicest parks in the Boston area. I'm sure you all walked around.
And it was obsolete as a reservoir soon thereafter.
Yes.
When did they convert it to a park?
Not that long before.
No, the Chestnut Hill Reservoir was built in about 1870, and it essentially cut off because it was built right over the aqueduct.
Yeah.
So it cut off the flow at that point. Brookline Reservoir became basically redundant and auxiliary, and it was sold by the city in 1903 at that point.
For $300,000.
I remember.
$150
There's
for
actually-
Brookline.
Yeah, right.
There's actually a plaque.
Lee was one of them. It came to $50,000.
Oh, there were 20 or 30 people who contributed toward that $150,000.
Well, the three big areas, who were they? Do you remember them?
White was one of
Lee,
them. White, I think, was one.
They're all named, streets are named after them, but I've forgotten who they are.
Mostly people who lived around the
Yes.
reservoir.
Well, Henry Lee and.
Lee, certainly.
There's actually a plaque right on one of the edges that explains this history, which is very interesting. And then also the new Waterworks Museum also sort of explains when the Chestnut Hill Reservoir took over for the Brookline Reservoir,
Yeah, and I recommend that to everybody if you've not been to the Waterworks Museum. You really like
which is
it.
free.
It's a terrific place. Well, thank you very much for coming out. It's good to see all
Thank
of
you.
If you're here, there's sign-up sheets for you so you can get credit for coming.